Digital change swept the UK business landscape in early 2020. Customers needed support without being able to visit physical stores or offices. Employees dialed into work from their kitchen tables and their bedrooms. Businesses previously used to paper-based processes were forced to digitize practically overnight. We're here to talk about the effects of all of this digital transformation. Welcome to The New Everyday with me, Eileen Burbidge, a podcast from Virgin Media Business. Today's topic is Jumpstarting Digital Change, where we're looking in more detail at the opportunities brought about by the rise in hybrid working and how digital services are creating happier employees, more satisfied customers, and more productive businesses. Joining me today, we've got Janine Chamberlain, the UK Country Manager and VP of Global Clients Programme at LinkedIn. Janine is responsible for leading LinkedIn's business in the UK, helping them to connect, learn, and find new opportunities. She has written and spoken extensively on new ways of working in a digital world. Hi, Janine.
Hi, thanks.
Also with us today is Natalie Nelson, Technical Advice Lead for NatWest Mentor. Day to day, Natalie works in the space of horizon scanning, where her teams consult with clients on new trends and considerations. Prior to this, Natalie has 10 years of experience in HR at NatWest, advocating for new ways of working. Great to have you here, Natalie.
Thanks.
So we can't talk about digital transformation without talking about hybrid working today. And recent research from Virgin Media O2 Business, done in partnership with the Centre for Economics and Business Research, CEBR, found remote working has accelerated digital change. Remote working has risen from 1.4 days to 2.3 days a week as a direct result. So I'm really curious to hear from both of you, and maybe we can start with Janine first. In your respective companies, so at LinkedIn, what was the approach to hybrid working before the pandemic, and then how has that changed now subsequent to it?
Yeah, it's an interesting statement as well. Is it that digital change is fueling remote working, or remote working is fueling the digital change? So yeah, it's changed a lot, obviously. I think the pandemic has certainly proved that we can do it, that we can work remotely and we can still be productive. And at LinkedIn, certainly, if I think back 2 years ago, quite frankly, it would be less common to work remotely or even to work predominantly at home as opposed to being in the office. We very much have an office-based culture. We've always celebrated collaboration, being together, making sure that we have that connection. So we've got some really fantastic office spaces where everybody, I think, always really enjoyed coming together. Now, fast forward to where we are today, we can hear from our employees, we listen to them through surveys, that still about 90% of our employees want to be in the office some of the time, but almost nobody wants to be in the office all of the time. And so it's really about bringing those two worlds together. We see most people coming into the office just 1 or 2 days a week and then working remotely the rest of the time, which is a stark contrast to where we were 2 years ago.
Amazing. It is just happened overnight, hasn't it? I mean, I do remember, like you say, how before the pandemic, there was almost a stigma if you said you wanted to be remote, before, and you wanted to sort of stay out of the office or at least try and have a home day to be more productive or something like that. And now it's quite something. And I think there's something about the vocabulary as well. We called it always remote or working from home, and now everyone's calling it hybrid and sort of acknowledging that it doesn't matter where it is. So I think that's really great to hear. What about you, Natalie? What differences, or how was it before the pandemic and how is it now?
I think there's actually a lot of similarities from what Janine shared in terms of how LinkedIn have worked. So I think pre-pandemic in NatWest, it was pretty mixed across teams in terms of we did have some people in some roles that would work in what we now refer to as a hybrid way, so working from home, but probably more predominantly maybe 1 day a week, 2 days a week. There were lots of teams that wouldn't have worked at home at all. And you started to touch on, I guess, the culture change. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting to think about is that culture of presenteeism. So I think culturally, maybe in the past, there is an expectation of if people are in the office, they seem to be productive. And I guess leaders as well may think, oh, actually, if I can see my teams in front of me working, I know what they're doing in terms of productivity. So that the culture in terms of leadership and how we need to manage teams moving forward has changed overnight. So in NatWest, everybody started to work from home, apart from obviously there was some roles such as our branch staff who have never been home workers and won't be. prior to the national lockdown. So we made that decision that was what we were going to do. And luckily we had the technology set up to enable that. But quite quickly, leaders in the business had to think, right, I'm now managing teams remotely. How do I check in with them? How do I know that they're doing their job and they're not out doing washing or, looking after their children? Yeah. But of course, people were looking after their children because the children were also in lockdown. Yeah. So it's been a really interesting time. But now we've come through post-pandemic, been really clear in terms of strategy. So we have remote first workers, which I fall into that category. So very much knowledge workers. And we generally go into the office a couple of days a month for collaboration. So not to go and sit on Zoom meetings, but actually to meet people face to face. And there's real value in that. And I think that's something that Janine mentioned as well. We also have fully hybrid workers. So they may be individuals that maybe are in customer facing roles. And we have some roles that need to be in the office permanently due to regulatory reasons or because of the physical environment that they need to do their job. So quite a range.
No, it's really interesting. And I noticed when you were describing the sort of pre and post, situation at NatWest, you talked about how the office-based sort of culture was a lot about checking in, being productive and feeling like one could be more productive if you could see other team members being productive. And so that really means that managers not only had to, get used to new ways of working and being aspiring leaders and managing people remotely, but they also had to figure out, like you said, how to sort of gauge but also encourage greater productivity with remote and sort of hybrid situations. And the other thing that I'm sort of recognizing is you said after the pandemic, you now go back to the office and try to have team days in order to collaborate and to sort of do more together. That also brings me to thinking about the fact that there was some other research from that same CEBR study, which also said that of those who have an opinion about remote working, 90% of the employees say that it helps them to build their working day around other commitments because that improves their work-life balance. It saves them time and money. It reduces their commute. And so as a consequence, employee satisfaction rates are up 3.6%. Is that what you're also seeing at NatWest and LinkedIn?
Actually, there's a few thoughts coming up for me here. So first and foremost, absolutely, I think this is driven by employees who want this flexibility. They've had this flexibility over the last 18 months and they don't want to let go of this flexibility wherever it is possible. Do I see a direct correlation between job satisfaction? I find it hard to give an absolute yes to that because what I'm also seeing is people are quite drained, I think, after the pandemic and the ongoing pressure of the pandemic. And now having to think about, should I actually go into the office? What if I don't show up and my colleague does show up? We've done some research into this, and 2/5 of workers in the UK specifically have said that they are concerned there is still a stigma around working from home, and that they're worried that their boss might favor the person who shows up in the office and is directly visible to them. So I think during the pandemic, it was a fantastic level playing field. Everybody was working remotely, and therefore managers had no choice but to treat everybody in the same way. But now that we are mixing these two fields, I think we're still learning how to do that well, and managers have to continuously, I think, be educated on how to lead with empathy and how to lead with trust in making sure that everybody is treated in the same way and still has the same opportunities to thrive regardless of the working location. So I think there's still some developments that we will see over time in terms of how this is going to settle for the longer term.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And I think that point that you talked about in terms of people feeling concerned, and actually, maybe managers have unconscious biases that they're not aware of in terms of people in the office and people who choose to work from home more, because you're right, this is about choice. I'm seeing a lot of that in external research as well. So it's quite nice to hear from you in terms of you're saying that LinkedIn. I think that's similar for NatWest and a lot of, I guess, other larger companies that I'm reading about and smaller as well. So it's how do we continue to make sure that people are treated in an inclusive way, and also leaders are aware that they might hold these biases, and how do you measure actually results by outcomes, not by how long you've seen somebody in the office. Or so I think there's a lot to do in terms of culture change to catch up with everything that's happened in the last 18 months to 2 years.
Absolutely. And that you both made some key points that I want to try and follow up on. So I've got two forks I'm going to try and dive into. One is you both mentioned how there's more development to come for managers and for leaders. Are you seeing ways of doing that? Do you have any lessons learned? Are you developing programs for your leaders, or are you seeing maybe best practices elsewhere?
So I can start, and actually I can talk a bit about what we're doing. So obviously NatWest Mentor also provides advice to external companies in terms of management and leadership. So we're looking at how do we incorporate hybrid and remote working into some of our training programs to help educate workers. We've updated policies, handbooks, because there's quite a lot to think through. What does that mean for how you reward people, how you recognise them? Are the benefits you offer still relevant for new ways of working? So I think it's all about working through this together and learning from each other and experience. But yet there's a lot of work, and there's a lot of work across the bank as well in terms of, how do you manage your teams remotely? How do we keep connecting with people? And I'll touch on another theme now before I stop talking about this very topic, but I can't come here and not talk about the topic of wellbeing. It's something that I'm personally passionate about. I'm very lucky to work with NatWest, who have put a very strong focus on wellbeing pre-pandemic, but obviously we've really had to scale that up. But it's also educating line managers. How do you, A, look after the wellbeing of your employees in what is quite fast pace of change at the moment, so during and now post-pandemic, but also we've really had to work with line managers to really help them think about how do you look after yourself and build your own resilience, because it's not just the general employees that have struggled with this. Line managers and leaders who are, your teams are looking up to you for support. They're also going through their own dilemmas and struggles and balancing work with life.
Absolutely.
Lines have become slightly blurred.
I have to tell you, that's one of my favorite outcomes of the pandemic. I mean, obviously the pandemic wasn't necessarily a good thing, but if we've got some lessons learned or we've evolved, in a certain way, whether it's the workplace or otherwise society at large, one of my favorite normalizations is that of empathy. And whereby now people at work, we used to have these lines sort of, we'll talk about work and I'm working with you as a business colleague and I'm not necessarily going to go into your personal life because, that's personal. And what I love now is that, I'm not saying everyone's nosy, but I think everyone has a bit more empathy now in recognizing that everyone's situations before, after they go to work, while they're trying to contribute from wherever they are, is very different. And we actually got a physical look into some people's workspaces, and you could appreciate that they were working in a certain setup that might not be the same as yours, that they might have pets going back and forth in front of the monitor or their webcam, or they might have children or people they're looking after and other people in the household. And it's just this normalization that people have lives outside of work, and that, as you say, leaders and line managers need to be cognizant of that and recognize how they can support people a little bit better. Having said that, sorry, Janine, did you have anything else that you've developed actually at LinkedIn or maybe companies that you've worked with to help support managers with their development with this?
Yeah, I think just going back to the research around what we've called proximity bias. So we've studied surveyed both our members on the LinkedIn platform as well as a number of C-level executives in the UK. And both groups agree that there's concern around still having a stigma around remote working and what this might mean for the ability for people to progress in their careers. But what's really promising is that out of the C-level executives, 2/3 have specifically said that they are investing in training for their managers to make sure that they are set up well for this hybrid world of work. And in addition to that, they're also freeing up more budget for social gatherings or social activities to make sure that that connection comes back. And I think people really crave that connection. I was just thinking about this the other day. When at the height of the pandemic, I guess, when everybody was still working remotely, certainly and I've seen it a lot around me within the organization, was doing a lot of virtual events and virtual coffee connects and things like that. But now that this blended world has started, it seems to have fizzled out a little bit, but people still crave that connection, especially because not everybody is in a position to come back to the office yet or doesn't want to come back to the office. And so I think it's really important that we continue to invest in bringing people together in this blended way, both remote as well as in person. And then how do you do that in a way that everybody feels included? I think that's going to be where the magic is.
You're absolutely right. And I think this whole notion of inclusion, or, you talked about sort of leveling the playing fields. Hopefully we can carry that forward, even as some people start to go back more often than others. And again, with this empathy that different people have different circumstances, which I don't think we were quite as forgiving as before. So the other topic that I wanted to dive into, based on what you both had said previously, is how we now measure productivity. Are there digital tools to help do this? Is there a way that technology helps to solve this, or help address, any kind of ambiguity about whether or not someone's truly being productive? How do we equip managers, to gauge that from people when they're working remotely? Any ideas of that?
It's a really challenging topic, actually. There's quite a lot of debate on this at the moment, because I guess there's a piece about if you're monitoring people's work, is that an invasion of privacy, particularly if, they're in their
And trust, a breach of trust, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on the role. So there's some roles where it's quite easy to measure productivity because of the nature of the work that they're doing and the stats that you have around that. But on a lot of the roles, it's actually about being really, really clear in terms of what expectations are. So what are the objectives? What does good really look like? How are you going to measure that? And having regular, good, continuous performance conversations. So I think it goes back to the theme that we've already touched upon in terms of productivity.
Yeah. And actually equipping managers with the tools that they need and the training that they need to recognize this. Would you agree with that, Janine?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's so interesting because I think measuring productivity, there's absolutely a lot of tools out there. And, I won't mention any specific names, but I think any kind of software that you use will give you an ability to somehow track whether people are interacting with it and how often and how long it takes to resolve things and whatever else. But I think sometimes productivity measures can almost backfire because you might be stimulating the wrong kind of behaviors. Do you really want people to be sending more emails? Probably not. Like, you want people to be focused on delivering the results that ultimately you're aiming for as a company. And I think the only way that you can make that work well is if you trust people to do their job in the way and at the location where they can do their job. So I think it's about establishing this foundation of trust, setting clear expectations on the outcomes rather than sort of productivity measures that I really think can create the wrong culture.
I like that. It basically comes back to making sure our managers are better at communicating, setting expectations, and therefore sort of engaging with people in terms of what's really going to make an impact or demonstrate productivity and contribution. So maybe taking that a bit, do you think there are certain roles or certain job titles that are better suited for that or are going to be quicker for managers to adapt with? For instance, Natalie mentioned customer service or people that were working with clients in branches, for example. Or do you think it's actually we're back to sort of needing to have a level playing field so that there won't be any distinction?
It's really difficult. It's a challenging question. It goes back to the debate that we've just been talking about in terms of if you focus too much on measures. So think about customer service type roles, for example. You'll have stats on how many calls they've taken. If they're in a sales function, you'll have stats on how much income they've generated, for example. But if you focus on the stats too much and not the behaviours, which was exactly
Janine just said, yeah,
that can lead to issues. So it's all about getting the balance right. So yeah, much easier to measure performance in those types of roles. But I think I just go back to the point, and you started to touch on that actually in terms of what you were just saying. It's around clarity and being really clear from the start. And I think if you've got that clarity of objective and what could look like and the behaviours that sit around that and the values, then that's when people will be set up for success.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And what I would add to it, and it's just also based on my own observations over the last 6-12 months, there's something around engagement that drives productivity. And so I think if anything, managers, in my view, would do well to really focus on engaging their team members, giving them a clear sense of purpose. Why are they doing this? Why is it important that they do this? Because I think that drives much more productivity than a set of metrics that everybody needs to tick the box on, right? And when you are working remotely, I do believe it becomes easier to feel a little bit detached because you're not constantly surrounded by your colleagues, your work environment, which probably has lots of, I'm just looking at myself behind me. There's some wonderful posters that tell me why it's so great to be a part of this company. We don't have that at home, so it does become a little bit easier to get detached. And that's why I think managers should really focus on that engagement and just keeping employees focused on why they're doing what they're doing.
So picking up from that, actually, it's really interesting because I think one sector that's had to adapt even more quickly than ever has been the health sector. According to the research we outlined at the beginning of the episode, the sector has seen more than 4 years of progress with respect to digital change in just 18 months. Digital acceleration has led to a 7.3% increase in patient satisfaction and a 5.1% increase in employee satisfaction. We caught up with Dr. Ben Wright to talk about the practical implications of digital transformation for patients.
Hi, so thanks for having me along today. My name's Ben Wright. I'm the Chief Clinical Digital Officer for East London NHS Foundation Trust. I also practice as a consultant psychiatrist in medical psychotherapy. So I've been working for East London NHS Foundation Trust during the COVID period and can tell you a bit about our experience for what it's been like for us on the front line. I think our institution, like many in the NHS, suffered from significant organisational inertia. We were very used to doing things in a certain way, having face-to-face meetings, seeing patients face-to-face, despite the presence of video consultation material and other digital ways of working being readily available for many, many years. I think the upside of the catastrophe of COVID has been in forcing us to cut out what was no longer essential and making the change to virtual working really to carry on delivering care as best we could under the circumstances. And that absolute requirement forced two main changes. The first was around a change in the way we deliver clinical care, and the second is the way in which we work together collaboratively as professionals, both within the organisation and outside the organisation. In terms of how we changed our ways of working clinically, we moved to virtual consultations, delivering psychotherapy through the media, mainly in our case of WebEx and the other platforms that we had. And what was absolutely fascinating over this period is that our recovery rates increased. So clinical outcomes improved by about 5 to 10%. So I did a bit of analysis around that to try and understand why it was that despite the fact that we were no longer seeing people face to face, we were able to get better clinical outcomes. And the first question I asked is, well, are we cherry picking? Are we just seeing the easy cases and the difficult ones are staying away? And no, in fact, the proportion of people who are coming into the service increased and actually improved. So that showed we were getting a better access, so a more challenging case mix. So why was it that people were getting better? And what we found is that actually the number of completed appointments had improved, that people were less likely to not attend for their appointment, which effectively means that the effective dose of treatment was increasing and therefore our outcomes were improving. And I think this was borne out by discussions I've had with the patients who I've looked after. And they've talked to me about how they can have a really difficult session with me. I do notice, but try not to comment on it, that some of them turn up in their pajamas or their T-shirt, not as, how should we say, as polished as they would normally look if they came to see me in clinic. They have incredibly distressing, difficult sessions, as they would. But I then know that they then, can stay on their couch in the safety of their house behind the security of their locked front door as they recover from the session and don't have to make an exhausted schlep back from the clinic home. In one case, is actually a patient of mine was having a particularly difficult session, and we like to call her co-therapist. Her puppy came up and gave her a good lick to comfort her during a session, which was very touching. But overall, people prefer having therapy in the privacy of their home, and I think that's why we've had better outcomes. But of course, you'll say quite fairly, well, what about those that can't? What about those that don't have the equipment or don't have technological skills? We think that's about 1 in 7. And in fact, the bigger rate limiting factor is less the access to technology of skills, but actually the private space. For many folk, particularly those from a more deprived background, they simply don't have the privacy at home. So we looked at what we could do with that. And I have to give a shout out to Cisco, who are our digital partners at East London, and particularly their CEO, who donated to WebEx boards. And they stood up their engineering team to reconfigure these boards as kiosks. So the way it works is the patients come in, they sit down, they touch the screen comes to life. I've already logged in as a therapist. There I am on the screen. I can see them. And in the privacy of a clinic room, which would otherwise be too small for consultation during the kind of COVID era that we're in, they're able to have a confidential consultation with me remotely, without any technical skill whatsoever. And that's worked incredibly well. And there are many patients who otherwise would not have been comfortable attending for therapy or not have been able to access therapy who've been able to have effective courses of action. We plan to roll this out more broadly. So we have rolled out kiosks in our IAP services in East London and in Bedfordshire. But we also are putting in a bid to NHSX to provide digital pods for our perinatal patients so that they can access care. And we're thinking of putting them in community locations. And we think that that's going to be able to provide a much more dynamic service, because for me to go to one of those community groups, it's going to take me an hour or so to get there. I'm going to have the consultation. The person may or may not turn up. I then have an hour and a half to get back again. I mean, that's a massive chunk of time. Whereas if we're using the digital pods, if they don't turn up or they cancel at short notice, someone else can be slotted in as well. So it allows massive improvements in efficiency. The process is safe for both the patient and the clinician. It's much more responsive, much more efficient. And as I said, we often support patients making a transition to using digital assets at home. And in fact, East London is developing a digital enablement program specifically for this purpose. So we hope that in many cases, people will then transition once they've got the confidence into using digital assets at home.
That was Dr. Ben Wright, Chief Clinical Digital Officer at East London NHS Foundation Trust. And I think that was really, really interesting because he touched on so many themes. Firstly, that, remote offered some patients really the safety and the privacy that they didn't maybe otherwise have. And it actually improved what he said, were clinical outcomes and shortened recovery times. But that also uncovered a bit of a digital divide in a way, in that there were some patients who couldn't benefit from that luxury. And so what then they did in East London was to set up digital pods so that those patients could realize the same benefits. And I think what's fascinating is that none of this would have come about if it hadn't been for the pandemic. And he sort of described it as what I'd call sort of forcing function. Is there anything that chimes with or resonates with the experiences that you've had in terms of trying to improve outcomes, again, productivity, team contributions, deadlines, perhaps, with what you've done at NatWest or for your clients, the mentor network, for example?
Yes, I can think of a couple of actually quite simple examples for NatWest Mentor in terms of how we have used digital technology to improve and enable us to continue to serve our clients during the pandemic. So previously, the majority of the work that we would do would be face-to-face on client work. And we've got, I guess, one proposition, I'll use an example. We do have a training proposition. So we used to go to offices in-house, or we'd have public courses, hotel costs, travel time for both the mentor trainers, but also the businesses. So within a very short space of time, we've redesigned our training catalogue. So the majority of it is now, we're able to deliver it via Zoom technology. And we've also focused on building the skills of our trainers so they're actually able to deliver training on Zoom, because it's a very different type of skill. It's not as easy to read the room, to engage people when they might be sitting at home, looking at their tablet or their PC. So how do you keep that engaging? So I think that's a key thing. We've actually seen customers really like that element of training. So we've shortened the training session, so they're not full days. They can join sessions from their own office, so they don't have to leave the premises. And actually, I went on a customer visit over the summer, And I was talking to one of our customers about some health and safety training that they had previously had to leave the warehouse that they were in charge of for 3 days with overnight stay. And they were then on the way home going back and finishing a day's work at 7 o'clock at night. And they said, God, this is amazing. I didn't realise you could do this course over, 2 hours over a period of time. So I'm still here to be able to look after my business and help, my colleagues and customers. So I think that's been a real benefit. Also, where possible, where we've got consultancy services, we've been able to deliver a lot of that, again, via Zoom technology, where appropriate. So some of our health and safety services, you just can't do that. You have to be on site to really see what's going on and how you can support the customer. But yeah, we've seen lots of benefits. And I think our employees have enjoyed that, although they do miss the face-to-face customer interaction at times. But also, there's real benefits for the customers too in terms of cost saving, time saving. It's just more effective and efficient.
Sounds like it. Janine, do you see parallels between, what Natalie was just saying, but also what Dr. Wright was talking about with the NHS?
Definitely on the online learning, and actually coming back to what we were talking about earlier, people are craving this flexibility, and by offering courses online, it's really easy to do it at a time that suits you. So I think that obviously has been a big development. LinkedIn offers LinkedIn Learning courses, and we've seen quite a lot of progress, I think, within organizations of shifting to these digital formats. The other area where I've seen a lot of improvement, and I think organizations will continue to work in this way, is recruitment. It's been much easier to line up an interview process and get the right stakeholders involved because they didn't have to be physically in a specific location. It's much more efficient to do it online. You can have multiple people in a much quicker, much shorter time. Assessing people is, it's very doable. I think right at the start of the pandemic, I think back of some of my customer conversations then, people were hesitant to hire someone that they would have never met face-to-face. So they were like, we're going to see how it plays out over the next couple of months. We'll just do some assessments virtually, but really we want to meet the person in real life before we make an offer to someone. And that very quickly changed. And everybody, I think, that I speak to has realized that it's very effective, it's very efficient. You don't have to meet a person in real life. You can actually hire them through a process that is completely virtual, and then you can onboard them completely virtually as well. And I think that's here to stay because it's really saved companies a lot of time and a lot of money flying people over, as you said, or traveling to different locations. It's much easier to do it virtually.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think we've been talking about efficiency and we're talking about productivity. But this is another point that actually Dr. Wright spoke about as well in another part of the conversation. So I'm going to go back to him in terms of how we need to make these processes and these systems more efficient.
Well, when I first started as a consultant at the end of the 90s, I remember it was a rarity to have a computer. Your secretary might have one to do the typing for you, but it was pen and paper. We've gone from that to really everybody expecting to have access to a digital device and everybody expecting instantaneous access to electronic health records. And really, I think what I'm most struck by, and probably one of the biggest changes that industry needs to think about, is the enormous appetite for digital amongst the NHS in general and amongst healthcare professionals. They all know how digital has transformed their lives at home, and they're eager to have a similar experience at work. And I think certainly in my organization, we are behind the curve in terms of what people want and what they expect. And I think that industry needs to think about coming with ready-made solutions that work out of the box and are more easily deployed. If I spend £1 on a digital solution, I can expect to spend £2 on the configuration and adoption of that solution. The real costs around digital are not in the solution itself. It's around the transformation process to fully leverage the benefits of that solution. And I think industry needs to acknowledge that and think about solutions that are much easier to adopt.
So Dr. Wright's really kind of issued a call to action there, I think, for all of us in the digital sector or coming from, technology-enabled businesses, which is that we need to start thinking about solutions that are inclusive for everybody, easy access, and allow everybody else to participate in the efficiencies that we can see. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I think about a lot of the customers that we work with at NatWest Mentor, they won't be office-based, they won't be sat in front of computers. And actually, you think many workers across the UK or globally aren't office workers. So, for example, we've got quite a lot of people that we support in the construction industry or manufacturing, retail. So it's how do you provide digital solutions that are accessible when they might not have a device available at the time. And also some people they're not always comfortable with digital. So I think sometimes you think about different generations. Some of the younger generation, that's how they communicate generally. They're very, very comfortable and that's how they expect to communicate. But if you look at older generations, they haven't grown up with digital, so they've been going through a change and it might not be their initial preference and they might not have access to that. And I know sort of during the pandemic, NatWest, we've done a lot to support some of our more vulnerable customers. So lots of care calls to check they're okay, trying to get cash to them when they couldn't get out to make it to a cash point and the branches weren't open for as long. So we shortened our hours. So it's just trying to think about different communities and approaches and how can you educate people as well to sell the benefits of digital.
Well, and I was going to say, we know NatWest Mentor also does a lot of work with the social care sector, doesn't it? And so there's a lot of challenges there, not to mention sort of vaccination, helping to track that, education, information, obviously access to devices and systems that we were just talking about. We've had a forcing function, which is the pandemic. Is that, do you think, going to help the outcomes of people in social care through programs like what you offer at NatWest Mentor? Is there more that the industry at large needs to do? Would you call it, organizations like LinkedIn or those other types of networks, other ways we can all collaborate?
Yeah, I think there's always opportunity to collaborate. And it's funny you talked about social care, healthcare's come up today. I think there's some real challenges for those industries at the moment. You just mentioned vaccinations. Well, that's now going to be mandatory and they're probably thinking about what does that mean for their talent pipelines as well. Janine's mentioned digital recruitment. So there's real benefits there. So how can we work with Mentor in LinkedIn to help those types of industries? It's quite new to them. So it's around education.
Yeah. As you say, it's around education, and now it's going to be about maintaining this momentum, isn't it? And that's what sort of Dr. Wright's saying. We can't stop now, and he's actually issuing more calls to action so that we continue to improve. Janine, do you have any advice for either Dr. Wright, as he's in, the East London NHS Trust, or other people that might be in social care or other sectors, about how they can maintain momentum in their organizations?
So I think what's interesting, you were talking earlier about digitally enabled organizations, which pretty much every organization now is, even in construction, even in retail. When I look at the type of skills that every industry is recruiting for, it's about software development, it's about engineering, because all of these industries are now either still in that transformation or they have transformed because they have had to transform. And so that's why you continuously see these figures around 55% of the population needs to be upskilled or reskilled in the next 3 years. That's a lot of reskilling. And that's obviously also where you see the government is investing in reskilling and upskilling as well, particularly with a focus on digital skills. And so maintaining this momentum for me is about continue to invest in finding ways to help people get used to this new environment, to upskill, to reskill wherever required. There's no going back, I think is what I'm trying to say, that this is only going to continue to increase because it's made so many aspects of our lives easier and more efficient. So I think we're going to continue to see that.
It's so interesting because there's so much more we can talk about, but I think we're nearly running out of time. So I want to come back to each of you, though, and just take, what would be your biggest piece of advice to decision makers? And so to leaders, we talked so much about equipping managers and, helping the development of leaders, but what would be your biggest piece of advice to them on their next phase of hybrid working?
Challenging one, because there's so many things that we could touch upon, but I guess I wanted to build on what Janine just said as well, because that really resonates in terms of thinking about future skills. So for business leaders, I'd say, think about the change that we're seeing post-pandemic, post-Brexit, the economy. What will your business look like in the future? What digital transformation do you think you can expect? And therefore, what does that mean for the types of roles you'll need in your business? And can you start recruiting for those skills, building those skills now? And that's been a theme that we've focused on, I guess, in the HR community for a number of years pre-pandemic. And it really is coming to the fore now.
Now everyone has to sort of keep looking forward, right? And not to be complacent, I guess. Yeah. Janine, what would be your biggest piece of advice?
We're in such a unique time right now. You might have read about the Great Resignation, or we like to call it the Great Reshuffle. Every organization is thinking about how they rebuild and how they change their workplace, their workforce, and obviously their digital setup. So there's so much change going on, but that's a unique opportunity for leaders to really think about what's the shape of the organization that they want to build. And they can do that together with their employees. So I would recommend listen to your employees, work on this together, and shape the future of your business collectively, because you need that engagement ultimately to be successful in the future.
I love that, and how you've brought that back to engagement, which we've talked about so much today. So thank you so much. If people want to find out more about what you both do with your respective networks and access, so for example, Janine, how can people find out more about LinkedIn's insights and some of the studies that you quoted? Where would they be able to find that?
Obviously, there's the LinkedIn.com website. You can find my profile on LinkedIn. There's plenty of articles with references to all of the studies that I have talked about. So I would probably go there.
Oh, terrific. You might get more invitation requests after this. And then Natalie.
Always welcome.
Oh, super. Natalie, where can people find out more about NatWest Mentor?
So NatWest have our business hub. So if you search for NatWest Business Hub Mentor, have our own section on the business hub where we publish our thought leadership. We're also on LinkedIn. So follow NatWest Mentor on LinkedIn. And we also have a Mentor digital page where any business owners can sign up for that and just have a look at some of the insights that we share. So, yeah, a number of routes.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for all the work that you do in your organizations and to reach out beyond your organizations to help so many others. It's been absolutely fascinating to talk to both of you and also to hear, of course, from Dr. Wright. For those listeners, please hit subscribe if you want to stay up to date on the latest episodes. For more, join us in the final installment of the series, A New Everyday Culture, where we dig deeper into workplace culture and business strategy and how to ensure we sustain the momentum of digital change, ensuring everyone in the UK can benefit. For more information on the research we've talked about today and how technology is transforming how we live and work for the better, search Virgin Media Business CEBR. Thank you so much again, Janine.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's been a pleasure. And thanks so much, Natalie, for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. It's been a great conversation.
Until next time, this is Eileen Burbidge. Thanks so much for listening.